Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Policy Exchange, and today's event, Is Childhood Obesity as Bad as We Think? My name's Tamara Barnett, and I and James Cracknell have been working on a report on childhood obesity. For some of you, it'll be obvious, or maybe not hard to see why we're doing this, when 1% of people were obese in the 1960s, and it's now risen to 25%. But what has been so intriguing for us looking into this is that behind this perceived consensus of what the problem is and why, we found that when you delve further, there doesn't appear to be any consensus on anything at all. The first sort of debate and lack of consensus is around what causes obesity. There's the obvious debate between calories versus carbs versus inactivity versus genetics. There's a whole series of arbitrary factors that are also now cited, for example, pollutants. That would, for example, explain maybe why not only are people getting fatter and domestic pets getting fatter, but people are now saying that feral animals, for example, are getting fatter in this rather bizarre, we're all in it together, obesity crisis. But if we can't agree on the causes of obesity, then that means we can't agree on the solutions. But behind that question is the bigger question that we want to talk about today, which is, do we need a solution? You might have seen last week there was a whole series of headlines saying that loneliness is a bigger killer than obesity. You might have seen a few weeks before that other headlines saying that stress is the biggest cause of diabetes. So if stress and loneliness are bigger problems than obesity, then maybe we should be worried about why we're getting children to be stressed and isolated and worried about being obese. So that's the kind of question we wanted to ask today. We wanted an event that looked into the questions behind obesity. We didn't want to just assume we knew all these answers and can now find a nice healthcare pathway. And we couldn't have a more diverse, talented, I would say, and innovative group of people to talk about this issue than I think the panel we have today. And that includes our very own James Cracknell, who I'm now going to hand you over to chair this event. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. The question, is childhood obesity as bad? I think it's a real juggernaut of the question, and one that I think our esteemed and hopefully opinionated panel will struggle to answer in an hour, especially given that no nation has managed to arrest or decrease the rate of obesity. And that is the trend that I would like Britain to be the first nation to lead the way in that and have an effect on the situation that is going to impact on the whole of society in the future. My interest in this area was initially started by reading the 2007 Foresight report, Tackling Obesity, Future Choices, which predicted by 2050, 60% of adult men, 50% of adult women, and 35% of kids under the age of 16 could be obese, costing NHS 10 billion a year. And there are so many statistics and figures in this area. You can choose to believe or ignore so many of them, depending on what you want to do. But the consensus seems to be we're going to hit those targets. We're ahead of target, which is great. We're going to hit that by 2035. The real benefit of having the guys here is that they'll be able to state their beliefs and back that up with their relevant expertise. But before introducing them, I thought it'd be better to actually state where I'm coming from. As a ex-sportsman, I wasn't just fit and healthy because I needed to be in order to win. It was because it was something that I believe is vitally important for all of us to make the most of our lives, our kids' lives, and ultimately their kids' lives. And if you don't start looking after yourself, that's not going to be possible. And for me, the legacy of the Olympics, it's a bit of an overused word that's become so commonplace since 2012 that was never there before. And if you think in 2012, we were third in the Olympic table, in the medal table, behind America and China. But we were first in the women and second in the men's obesity table in Europe. So just being good at sport doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a fit, healthy nation. If you take the country that's top of the medal podium, they're also top of the chart as well. So it's it's not there, and legacy is not finding and nurturing the next sporting talent. It's achieving physical activity and making sure we are living a more healthy life and active lives. And national surveys show there's been a decrease in calorific consumption since the 1970s. The Institute for Fiscal Studies saw a 30% drop in calorie content of the food purchased by families in 2013, compared with that before the obesity crisis. But also, in 2008, the World Health Organization, 66% of people over the age of 15 in the UK were inactive, 33% of boys, 21% of girls between the ages of 4 and 15. They're the only ones that met the minimum levels of physical activity required for basic health needs. This is a scale that you can break into, or there's a problem you can break into the circle at any point, whether it be eating, whether it be exercise, whether it be social, economic group. But the reality is currently 1 in 10 children enter our primary school obese, 1 in 5 leave obese, and critically, of those obese 11-year-olds, 82% will go on to be obese adults. And I remember watching a documentary when I was at school called 7 Up, and it's the tagline was, "Give me a child till he is 7 and I'll give you the man." And now we're in a situation where that's, if you have an obese 11-year-old, you're predicting the social stigma, the perception of laziness, weak will, the increase in morbidity and non-communicable diseases. We need to sort out a situation that they're not in that position by the time they're 11. But at primary school, they're involved in pretty much sedentary activity for 7 to 8 hours a day. So we need to change. And in fact, the 2014 Educational Strategy on Behaviour and Discipline in School suggested, as a way of solving poor discipline, physical activity such as running around a playing field. Now, if we're suggesting physical activity as a punishment, that's not exactly the best way to get people to choose to do it. And I'm not talking about, this is where people get it wrong, we're not talking about competitive sport, we're talking about being physically more active and building that into part of your life rather than competitive sport, which doesn't appeal to everyone. I used to spend a lot of time rowing in a boat, and that didn't appeal to me for a long time, till at least it got sunny anyway. Inactivity, according to the World Health Organization, is the 4th leading risk factor for global mortality, 6% of global deaths, and obesity is responsible for 5% of deaths. So they're both big problems, and part of one and the same problem. It's about how we approach that. And I'd really be interested to hear the speaker's thoughts and opinions on 2 things specifically. Firstly, about obesity, is it the visible sign of a nation's ill health? There are just as many people underweight as obese, which is arguably a greater threat to child's health and physical and cognitive development. And secondly, opinions on the National Child Measurement Programme and the value of BMI as a measure, and especially as a predictor of ill health. Physical activity is arguably a better predictor of ill health, and also the feedback mechanism to families. And tomorrow and I, we've spoken to people building up the report, and the one thing that keeps getting mentioned is, after the measurement programme, the receipt of the fat letter, which then isn't exactly motivational and generally goes in the bin, and you've lost communication with that person. So there is a real way of how we're going to break into this problem at a variety of levels, and as policymakers, it's important to put yourself in they put themselves in a place where the families that are really suffering, they don't have meals around a table, they don't eat together, they eat on a lap, they haven't got the same standard of living and income as the people who are making the policies, and it's important that we can relate to and understand exactly how to have the biggest impact on them. And that's where we need to start, because no country's got it right, we haven't got it right, but it's going to take a brave country, and I believe we can be that one, to make the change that's needed. I'll now move swiftly on to the experts. First one up is Andrew Lansley, who is former health minister, was a massive believer in proactively sending out the way that we actually do need to do something about obesity and putting into place a pathway for that to happen. And that's what we need to do. I think we need to be stronger on that, but I'll let Andrew come and tell us how we're going to do it.
James, thank you very much. And I'm not sure I will be an expert for these purposes, but I've certainly been there and had the responsibility. And so I'll start it off with that, because I hope what we might do today is try to push forward ideas of how one can convert evidence and research into policy. That's what it's all about, trying to make better policy as time goes on. From my point of view, you're right, James, I did see it as very important, not least because actually we had pretty much 2 decades during which obesity in this country had been increasing rapidly and at almost as fast as any European country. But actually, in terms of the policy responses in public health documents, it was almost neglected. In 2004, the Public Health White Paper virtually ignored obesity at the time at which it was developing and increasing rapidly. There is a risk. Back in 2010, one of the first things I and my colleagues did was to set the work in hand to the Public Health White Paper, Healthy Lives, and that was published at the end of that year, because we were very concerned that there was a risk that there would be an endless political focus on the National Health Service, too little public focus and political focus on public health. That is still a risk. We should always be constantly fighting against that. But we did, for the time being at least, manage to focus on public health, the structures to support public health, and what we're trying to achieve. We did create new structures. Some have persisted, some have not. I was chair of a public health subcommittee of the Cabinet until I left the government, or at least I moved to be leader of the House of Commons, and then that subcommittee disappeared. So there is no longer such a subcommittee. So we do have to keep focusing on public health to make it happen. What the White Paper was about was not only creating a new structure in Public Health England and involving local government centrally in the delivery of public health, but that was happening for a reason. Because actually, if we want to improve the health of the population, the things that we have to change are not principally inside the National Health Service. If you wanted, for example, to have a healthier country, you would want to reduce inequalities in society. If you wanted to improve health, public health, you want to reduce deprivation, improve people's incomes, their living standards, their housing, their green space, the environments within which they live, the character of their lives. So public health must necessarily be seen as a cross-government responsibility, and many of the policies or the services that are likely to have the biggest impact on people's public health, population health, are actually in the control of local government. So let's be absolutely clear. We are still in the early stages of health and wellbeing boards and local government taking on these responsibilities, which they did just 2 years ago. But I think it is a central objective, should be for local government to be encouraged, held to account, promoted in turning their public health responsibilities into a population health benefit. Now, there was more to this white paper as well. What I think we were convinced had happened in the past was that public health was being treated as with apologies, there was a slight sense of that happening. You know, what is the latest risk factor to public health that we are going to focus on now? So one day it's tobacco, and the next it's obesity, and then it will be stress, and then it will be loneliness, and, you know, picking up the point that you were making. It can't be like that. Delivering population health improvement cannot be a contest between competing risk factors. If we let up on tobacco control, thousands of people will die. So we must not let up on tobacco control, and we are not letting up on tobacco control. We have the best tobacco control regime in the world. But because we have the best tobacco control regime in the world, does not mean we must have a lax obesity regime. We have to have a really effective one. Now, the question is, with apologies, it isn't about setting, in that sense, setting priorities. At a local level, people do have to set priorities, and there will be places in the country where local authorities and clinical commissioning groups working together in health wellbeing boards have a responsibility to assess their local population health and determine where their priorities may lie. So, for example, in my own area, as it happens, when we make comparisons of what we would expect to be, for example, mortality rates, we are higher than we would expect on only one or two measures. We're actually one of the healthiest places in the country, but people tend to die in road traffic accidents. So, of course, you do have to focus on that and say, well, why is it worse than it ought to be? So, but where obesity is concerned, meeting here today is a very interesting moment, because I think we are at a point where, certainly for the pre-teens, we've had at least 3 decades of rising obesity. So we have a rising tide form of epidemic. We're at a point where the tide is no longer rising, but neither is it ebbing. So the question is, where do we go from here? It seems to me we have an opportunity to turn this tide back. The question is, what do we need to do to make that happen? It's not going to happen on its own. It's going to require a lot of change. Now, at the risk of just quickly running through a whole range of things, in my experience, in policy terms, on almost all of the risk factors leading to poor population health, there is no silver bullet. One must have, in relation to what are multifactorial problems, multifactorial solutions. So I do earnestly say, don't please think you kind of have a list and people go, that's the thing we must do, and that will solve our problem. Do them all, measure them all, and try to assess what contribution all of the measures can make to the overall outcome. That's what I do say measure advisedly, because as Secretary of State I did have a responsibility. We did get challenged more than once about the child measurement programme. I think if you don't measure, you don't achieve things, frankly. We've got to have measurement. We've got to know what is going on. The way we handle that with individual families and parents has to be sensitively done, but collectively we must understand in as close as we can in real time what progress we're making. Now, with young people, I will freely admit to my own prejudices. I actually think a large part of our problem is about lack of physical activity. I think James was right about in drawing our attention to the long-term health consequences of inactivity. I think I can say perfectly, I think it's valid to say that we have a lot of people who, through their lives, will tend to be overweight. 50% at least of the population will tend to be overweight. If, however, they are physically active, in terms of their morbidity, that will make an enormous difference. If they are overweight and inactive, we are going to have a rising tide of morbidity that will potentially can overwhelm all of our public health systems. So what we absolutely must do is promote physical activity. Well, where is physical activity most likely to be acquired and from then retained? Answer, in childhood. Those are immensely important habits. From my point of view, we did encounter this, and of course, early on in the government, because of the way in which reform in schools was taking place, was about handing the budgets to schools and letting them decide what they do with it. There was a gap at risk of emerging in the specific support to school sports coordinators and sport and physical activity in schools. Happily, between myself and Jeremy Hunt at DCMS at the time, we were able to plug that gap, and actually the policy in the Department of Education came back to fill that gap as well in subsequent years. So, but we actually funded out of the Department of Health school sports coordinators, and also at the same time through Change for Life, which is a programme we carried on and expanded, we also went into development of school sports clubs, particularly, of course, in primary schools. And it was entirely complementary, because the school sports coordinators and the work they do was very much about trying to promote competitive and team sports, the Change for Life programme in sports clubs in schools was very much about promoting a whole wide range of new kinds of physical activity that were not in themselves necessarily competitive and were designed for every child to be able to take part. Nobody left out. And that, I think, for us was a very important part of Change for Life. Change for Life was also important in that it was directed working with families. Because, of course, I'm sure it's a truism, but actually the most potentially powerful agents with children are their parents, their family. Far and away the most important. So we have to work with them to give them the support that they need in order to understand and improve life, the physical well-being of their children and their life chances. And Change for Life was designed to do that. Frankly, it comes down to a good example about not sitting around a table eating meals together. So Change for Life, I think it was in January 2012, one of the promotions in the new year of 2012 was a heavy discount if you went through Change for Life on tables. Seems a bit counterintuitive, but you do have to think laterally about this thing, and there was a whole load of that in Change for Life about substituting one product for another, in drinking water instead of fizzy, sugary drinks, about getting access to changing the way in which one eats. Now, from my point of view, with the public health programme was also very much about changing the environment within which families and children are brought up. James mentioned the Foresight report. It was important. It was an absolutely central study in terms of the evidence, but I will just repeat what I said at the time, because I think actually the presentation at the time it was published made a serious mistake, because what was taken out from the report was that we are living in an obesogenic environment. Now, I know what they meant, and I know that what they said was true, that actually the environment in which we live in terms of opportunities for physical activity and the character of diet that is provided at large amounts now for people of very calorie-rich and saturated fats-rich diets and sugary diets, lots of that available. Very easy for people, especially on lower incomes, to get the calories they need, but not necessarily get the diet they need. It's cheaper to get the calories you need than it is to get the diet you need, and that's something we knew we needed to change. So I completely understood the point that was being made by the report, but of course the public perception of we are living in an obesogenic environment is the environment is doing this to me and it's not my fault. And that is a very bad place to get to if people think it's going to happen anyway and what I do doesn't make any difference, because what I do does make a big difference. We do have to take responsibility. So the two strands, in that sense, have to work together. So there was the whole, as it were, if I characterise it, there's the whole Change for Life strand, which is about behaviour change, which is about all the nudges and the promotion and the opportunities for people to have more physical activity, to change, consciously to change their diet, consciously to improve their balance between calories in and calories out. But secondly, we do have to change the environment. And that is, of course, where the responsibility deal came in. The responsibility deal is about changing that environment. So I won't go through all the measures in it, but it was, for example, about achieving more quickly than we could in any other way the virtual abolition of trans fats. It has been very successful in relation to salt. We need it to be equally successful in relation to the reduction of sugar in diet. We need it to work on portion size. It's got a lot of information out into the high street on calorie content of foods in foods eaten out of the home, because we reached the point where a third of calories for many families were being consumed out of home rather than in home. There's a lot of data on, there's lots of packaging information on products, on foods bought in shops, but there was relatively little information about the content, the dietary characteristics of food eaten out of the home. So we've got much more of that now coming through. We succeeded, I know in the summer of 2012, we succeeded in getting retailer and manufacturer sign up in the major retailers to a consistent front of pack labelling system. That was very important. That didn't happen back in 2004 when it was first mooted with the Food Standards Agency. We did deliver that. But I think most important is to make progress, as the responsibility deal is aimed to do, at reducing the calories in what people buy. So if I characterise it like this, if we could succeed in people might change their behaviour, but let's say they didn't, and people go to their shop, the supermarket, and their trolley has the same foods in it that they always used to buy, they don't change their behaviour at all, we would have reduced by something like, on average, 100 calories per person in this country, the calorie content of what they buy. Then we will get much closer as a consequence of that to sustaining a stable and healthy weight. Because that's where the 5 billion calories a day challenge comes from, is on average, and it is of course averaged across enormous variation, but on average, taking 100 calories per person per day in England out of the overall diet of this country. And in large measure doing it without people necessarily having to decide to stop eating things or change that much what they eat, but by reducing the calorie content of the foods that they eat. Now, this is very important for children too. If in the same way as we have reduced the salt content in cereals, we can reduce sugar content in cereals, if we can reduce fat content and sugar content in many of the foods that children eat, we will change their taste for the future. So if we can do that, we will change, I hope the same as we do with promoting more physical activity as something which is a basis for young people for the long term, we will change their taste for foods in the long term as well. And the combination of those two things, reducing calories in and promoting calories out, is of course at the heart of trying to tackle the obesity challenge. So in policy terms, that's what we were setting out to do. I have to confess, I fight against the analogy with tobacco. Susan Jebb was talking earlier this week, and she's, I have the utmost respect because she's led the food strand of the responsibility deal and done it extraordinarily well. But I don't like the analogy with tobacco. We haven't liked it with alcohol. I don't think we should adopt it with sugar. It's not the same thing. Tobacco is, from our point of view, we want a tobacco control regime which is constantly seeking to minimise, literally to minimise any consumption of tobacco. With foods, I think we have no choice but to think more in terms, food and drink for that matter, think in terms of helping people to take responsibility and control for themselves, reducing the alcohol content and the fats and sugar content of what they consume, but nonetheless recognising that they have choice and responsibility, not trying to take that away from them. And frankly, if we go down the tobacco analogy, we will also hit big problems in the tobacco control regime, because out there, all the companies will say, well, if you try to manage anything else by analogy with tobacco, the things you're doing to tobacco companies, you will do in due course to drinks companies and to food companies. And we can fight the tobacco companies. I'm not sure we're in a position where we can fight tobacco, drink, alcohol, food, every kind of manufacturing company all at the same time on the same basis.
Excuse me interrupting, but I was told that this meeting finished at 1:30. There are 3 other speakers.
Okay.
There will be time for contributions from the floor.
Righto. Well, I'm about to finish, actually. James is in charge, not you. But I'm about to finish. But I just wanted to make it clear that there is an analogy being presented with tobacco, and I don't think we should pursue that analogy. I think we can pursue the policy objectives in relation to obesity in their own terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, that's quite right. We do want the contributions and the chance to you to ask the speakers. And there's a couple of points I would like to take from that. I think it is going to have to be cross-departmental and also cross-party for there to be any significant change. And the NHS budget, it's a huge budget to so many issues that you have to control, but 95% is on treatment and 5% on prevention, and this is an area that we need to work on. In terms of the physical activity being part of it, the next speaker will be more than equipped than I am to talk about that. Dr. William Bird, CEO of Intelligent Health, one of the country's leading promoters of the importance of physical activity. He set up the national programmes Green Gym, Walking for Health, as well as Beat the Street for Children. In 2006, became a strategic health advisor to Natural Health England, and also sits on the Physical Activity Board for Public Health England. So not to load too much onto your physical activity plate, Dr. William Bird.
Thanks very much. And I'll just make a very kind of brief introduction, really, to where I feel the problem is. Because I think, actually, although we can, if you any of you ever looked at the obesity map that came out of the Foresight report, and you saw this massive tangled web of all interactions that came through to obesity, you'd throw your hand up and say, this is all too difficult, let's give up and just find something else. Actually, it's quite simple. And I say that from being a GP for 25 years, as well as running a company as well, to get people active. In the end, obesity is a symptom of a dysfunctional society. It's a symptom wherever you look around the world that obesity is a symptom, as is loneliness, as is crime, as is graffiti, as is lots of other things of a dysfunctional society. So you can focus on each of those areas if we want, but actually the best thing is to look at where that dysfunction is occurring. And it's actually because we are programmed to be hunter-gatherers. So I'm afraid our cellular, mitochondria, DNA, everything has fixed us to become good hunter-gatherers, and suddenly an environment has changed totally. So we're in a different environment to what we're designed to be. So that mismatch is causing problems. So we have to go back to actually thinking, what is our match? And our match is that we're social animals and we do not like to be isolated. We've heard about isolation twice. If we're isolated, we get stressed. So we want family, friends, work people around us. The next thing is the environment. As Andrew Lansley mentioned, hugely important. I was involved in getting green space, and the evidence now about green space in areas is so strong, how it affects the brain, how it decreases mortality, health inequalities. So the place we live has still a massive impact on our stress levels and how we feel. And the final is having a purpose. So if we have purpose in our life, we're not going to be rejected by the gang, by the crowd. We are going to be accepted because we have a purpose in where we're going. So if you're unemployed, you don't have any work, you don't have any voluntary, you don't have any education, you have a lack of purpose, which we know is a lack of autonomy, which causes all the problems. So it's a people, social, environment, green space but safety, and purpose. You get those three right, we reduce stress levels. And when stress levels are reduced, amazing things happen to the body. When we're stressed, we conserve energy. We put energy into our fat. So when we're stressed, we actually keep more fat than we should do in an area where we shouldn't have it, which is in the visceral fat. We also become inactive because we're conserving energy, waiting for the thing to happen that's going to happen. So when there's chronic stress, we become inactive, we eat the wrong things, and our fat goes in the wrong place. So having chronic stress actually leads very much to a society that becomes more obese and less active. You can throw a badminton racket, or you can tell people to jump up and down and give people fruit and everything else. But if they're in this chronic stress state, nothing is going to change. It's completely wasted effort. So when you become active and you remain overweight, your visceral fat goes, your actually health is almost back to normal. So weight, BMI, I feel, is a wrong measure. We shouldn't be measuring BMI as a success or failure of our health measures. Physical activity is more important. We know that obesity is important, and Paul will explain a lot about the physiology, but actually, overweight person that becomes active almost wipes away the problems there. So let's stop using a BMI as the end measure, and particularly of physical activity programs. That is absolutely against evidence and really should be stopped. We've got a program that delivers activity to about 15 to 20, 30,000 people in every town we go to. So Thurrock, in Grays, Tilbury, very deprived areas, we got over 16,000 people more active. In Reading, we got over 16,000 people more active, and we're about to get to 30,000 this year. And how do we do it? Well, we don't mention health, we don't mention weight, we don't mention activity, we don't mention anything. We mention raising money for the local hospital, improving your schools, getting together as a family and going on a bike ride to a place you've never been to, incentivizing, giving people teams, nudge theory, gamification. We create an entire environment for people to change their activity and not feel they're being lectured to. paid for by the CCGs and paid for by public health. So this is where I feel we should be going on our solution. The local authority is a health authority. The local authority, everything it does is about health. And public health is a small little bit in there which does measurement and advice. But actually, the whole authority about getting environment, education, transport is all about health. And obesity is in that. It's good education, it's a good environment, it's good transport, it's good employment, it's a nice place to live, it's a nice place to be. So I feel there's a huge amount of where we've been pushing in the wrong direction of trying to get health on board to create the solution, whereas actually the problem is created by the entire society, and we should be moving away from health and disattaching obesity from health and actually make people actually enjoy what they're doing and be in a nice place, a nice environment with purpose and with friends. Thank you.
Okay, I can see there's been some questions coming there. If it is across every area, could it not just be passed around from one to the other without someone grasping it and solving it? Some more strong opinion coming from next speaker, Professor Paul Gately, Professor at Leeds Metropolitan University, and a special research interest into childhood obesity strategies. Also a director of MoreLife, a leading national programme for children and community weight management services.
You can see the academic already. I'm using PowerPoint slides. I'm not as good looking as my fellow panellists, so I draw the attention to the pictures rather than myself. So I'm going to move to sort of answering the question. No. Oh, it's even worse. I would argue this issue is far worse than much of what we've heard today. And I would argue it's much worse because the action that we've had has been negligible. The talk that we've had is a lot. And what I'm going to try and do is provide some evidence around that. 1 in 3 of our kids have a weight problem. I believe very strongly in the National Child Measurement Programme. Tam Fry's here, and he's been one of the main people behind that programme, and many, many years has Tam been sort of promoting that programme. And it does one really important thing, which Andrew outlined very carefully, which is it provides us with information under which we can start to understand our population. But I absolutely accept the one thing we've done badly is communicate that to people we work with. I've worked with about 20,000 children and families who have weight-related problems, and the letters are a big issue. The way we communicate obesity is a big issue. And actually, as I'll outline, some of the consequences of that poor communication is just as much the problem that links with stress, mental health, and a whole range of other things. So we've got a big problem. One of the things that we've been hearing of late is we're starting to see this levelling off of obesity. Isn't it fantastic that childhood obesity rates are still levelling off? In some way, yes, it is. But unfortunately, what's happening is those worried well are actually starting to take on board the advice. Some middle-class families are the ones that are adopting the information and unable to put it into practice. But unfortunately, what we also know is that those children that are already obese, they're getting fatter. So more deprived communities are getting more obese, and the more obese are getting more obese. So that's where we've got to start to consider this as an issue. And the reason is simple economics. Simple economics. Well, probably quite complicated economics, but I'll try and make it as simple as possible. Here is some data from the US in 2005, but it's based on data in 2000. We've got quite poor health economic data, and I just want to draw your attention to this here. We have 2%, 2.5% or 2.8% of the US population have got very severe obesity, but they represent a significant amount of the expenditure of obesity. So if you look at 35% are overweight, they cost about 17 billion. 2% or just under 3% cost 11 billion. So there's a disproportionate cost of obesity for those at the high end of the obesity spectrum. And I think this is one of the fundamental issues which has been missed for the last decade, particularly in public policy within the UK. And in that document, it talks about the cost of severe obesity being substantial and more research is necessary. And only 2 weeks ago, there was a publication in the Lancet that outlined there's still few options, there's still limited research. So in that 10 years, it's arguable, it's pretty much, the evidence is clear, we have not done much about this agenda item at all. We have 140,000 children in the UK that are so obese that if they were adults, they would be immediately eligible for surgery. Okay? At the moment, there is not one local authority or one CCG that has investment plans in place to tackle that problem. Last year, we had about 60 surgical procedures for children under 16. We've got 140,000 of these children. We have to think very carefully about that. As James has outlined already, one of the reasons we have to consider that in children is because obese children become obese adults. One of the problems with policy of the last decade is also an assumption that everybody is at risk, and that is not borne out by the data. There was a public health document, DH document in 2006, which talks about the conveyor belt of obesity. But it isn't true. The evidence does not support that. What it shows is that normal weight children pretty much stay at the normal weight, overweight end of the spectrum. They don't shoot up. The only reason obese children transfer up is some sort of trauma during their sort of childhood or adolescence. So we've got to start to focus our attention on those that need the help the most. Only last week, data from the Health and Social Care Information Centre outlined we've seen a 60-fold increase in obese mothers giving birth. That creates the trajectory for moving forward. And we've got little action on this area too. One of the things that I think is also very missed about obesity is the consequences or the association with mental health. We work with obese adults, and our obese adults with a BMI 40 plus, so severe obesity, 80% of them have at least one mental health condition. At least one. We cannot get access for them into mental health services. So why are we surprised that they regain weight? Because we've not addressed many of the core components. However, when we've been able to work together to provide mental health as well as weight management support, we get very strong outcomes. So we've got to not just think about it as physical health, we've got to consider mental health. And here's the reason why. And this is some research from work we've done with children who are obese. These were 14-year-old girls, and we did an exercise called psychodrama, which is asking them to sort of outline their body shape and colour it in dependent on how they felt. So it's really trying to get at what is their emotions related to their weight. And what we've got here is a character that is actually quite happy. She recognises she's obese because you can see by the outline, but the colours demonstrate she's happy about that. She's not happy about weight, but she's happy. Emotionally, she's very happy and able to engage. Here's some other images. This clicker's a bit fast. When we link mental health to this, we've got a substantial problem. Let's not forget 140,000 children that are this weight. 80% of them have severe mental health issues. Our psychologists said they see these images typically in inpatient psychiatric wards for young people. And yet these were children referred to us from social services, from a whole range of services, but these kids are in mainstream school. So, the consequence of obesity, and I haven't got time to go into this, but economically, obese women earn $30,000 a year less than their normal weight counterparts. Educationally, obesity is a strong predictor of educational attainment at entry to school at age 5. Emotionally, we've already covered that. Socially, psychologically, and physically. The obese child has a terrible start to their life. And if we are thinking about future generations and a healthy population, as Williams articulated very strongly, we do not have a healthy population with one in three of our kids having this as a problem. So where should the focus be? And this is a question that I think many have touched upon, and this current government and the previous government, I would argue, have both focused their resources down this end of the spectrum. The 1 in 3 kids that don't necessarily have the problem, that won't have the problem in the future. We know school sport, sporty kids do school sport. Most of the obese children that we've worked with in the last 5 years tell us Change for Life programs are not for them. They're for the kids that are active or sporty. So it is not, unfortunately, looking after those that are most in need. So if we review investment into tackling this problem, and this is looking at Public Accounts Committee data, what it shows is that during 2005 to 2010, we spent about £1 billion a year on school food, school physical activity, school sport, walking, Change for Life. In the same period, for the 1 in 3 children that have a problem, we spent 0.04% of the budget on that 1 in 4 children. That, for me, I'm not an economist, but doesn't make sound sense. And really, now it's in the domain of public health, and I absolutely agree it's the place to be. But I believe that public health need an awful lot of work to be able to address this problem, because they are not doing a very good job at it at the moment. And look at the data. Here we have data. These in blue are the NHS-related costs. These are all from recent public policy documents. These are the estimated social costs of these different public health issues. Obesity dwarfs any of those other issues. Here's a report last year of a Freedom of Information request from all local authorities. Let's look at the data, because it's really important. Substance misuse, including alcohol, gets 30% of the budget. Sexual health gets 21% of the budget. There was a report 2 months ago that outlined sexual health levels are at the lowest they've been for nearly 40 years. Obesity, for 1 in 3 children that have this problem, 0.9% of the allocation. It is not having an impact. Oops. So, in summary, I believe it's even worse than what we think, because 1 in 3 of our kids and 2 in 3 of our adults have this problem. It's serious, it's varied, and it's incredibly expensive. Most expensive public health issue has the least investment. If you go to any local authority, 60 to 70% of that local population of substance misusers have access to services, whereas only 0.01% of the population of obese children in the country have access to services. And 30% of local authorities provide no services for the 1 in 3 children that cost them an awful lot of money. So since 2010, we have seen year-on-year declines on available funds to tackle childhood obesity. And one of the things that I just want to finish on in terms of the context of policy is the narrative. If we read the call to action on obesity, it is littered with personal responsibility of individuals and of the food industry. But 2 other policy documents, cancer and heart disease, they have absolutely no mention of personal responsibility, and every mention of the state's responsibility to tackle these 2 wicked diseases. However, if we look at the determinants of obesity, heart disease and cancer, they're genetic, they are programming, they are environmental, and they are lifestyle related. 40% of cancers are lifestyle related. Why is the policy narrative so different for obesity than 2 other most important health issues? That, for me, is part of the narrative that we really need to change. It's not about an individual's choice. It's about their response to the environment they live in. So I hope that has transitioned your view about it being a serious issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Right, so I realise time is pushing on, and the last speaker, I think, will certainly throw some powder into the fire. Rob Lyons, columnist for Spiked, and Science and Technology Director at the Institute of Ideas, which specialises in issues related to science, technology, health, food and the environment. So, small brief there. But especially for this arena, author of the controversial Panic on a Plate, How Society Developed an Eating Disorder. So he may throw a slightly different light on it before we open it up to some questions in the time that's remaining.
Thank you. When she was working on the report, Tamara met me for a coffee a few weeks ago, and we had a very long chat, and then a couple of days later She emailed me and said, would you like to come on and take part in this debate? I think you've got a really interesting point of view. I think that must be policy exchange code for come along and annoy everybody. So I will briefly state what my opinion of these things are, and, throwing powder on the fire, as James said. First of all, I think we should observe that forecasts about childhood obesity and, more importantly, adult obesity have been way too high and led to a great deal of panic and anxiety about this issue. Secondly, the notion that obesity is some kind of death sentence is mistaken. Thirdly, there's no simple solution. I think other people have discussed that. Losing excess weight is by no means simple. If someone finds such a solution, as a fat man, I would like to know the secret. And fourthly, if we overstate the problem of future obesity, then we'll end up introducing bad policies that restrict freedom and autonomy with little benefit to either obese kids or wider society. So first of all, the exaggeration of the problem, at least going forward. This was particularly bad about 10 years ago. This is the era when Jamie Oliver was doing his school meals programme, and he was coming out with some really wild claims that children would die before their parents, that fat, constipated kids could end up literally vomiting their own faeces, that poor school meals were somehow responsible for bad behaviour or a rise in asthma. And TV at that time was responsible for was full of other shows like this. You had, most famously, You Are What You Eat, with the misnamed Dr. Gillian McKeith, Fat Nation, Fat Club, Celebrity Fat Club, and most pertinently here, Honey, We're Killing the Kids. In reality, according people have touched on the stats already. I mean, if you look at the Health Survey for England, for example, the figures for both childhood obesity seem to plateau around about 2004, and they've gone down a little bit, and they've kind of bumped along around, it's markedly lower than they were back then. Other surveys and other measurements suggest different things, and as has been pointed out, this could be partly because some families have got skinnier just as other families have got fatter, and those two things are balancing themselves out at the moment. But certainly the idea of this nationwide obesity time bomb seems to be overstated. And the same with adult obesity. That seemed to peak, according to the Health Survey for England, in about 2010. It's kind of bumped along without going very much. Even in America, actually, there seems to have been a plateauing of the obesity rates. Compare that with what the Foresight report said in 2007. It said by 2025, 40% of Britons could be obese, and that seems highly implausible now. And by 2050, that more than half the population would be obese, as Andrew said. And I think that that's just implausible, just highly unlikely to happen. There's plenty of nuances, I'm sure, but I don't think there's any sign of that time bomb going off. The number of adults who are morbidly obese is just under 3%, and it's stayed that way for a little while now. Secondly, obesity is not the death sentence, and being obese is not a disease state in itself. If you look at the curve of life expectancy according to body weight, then it's a U shape. People who are very, very underweight and people who are very, very overweight, have markedly higher shorter life expectancies. But there's a kind of bit in the middle between people who are normal weight, overweight, and very mildly obese, where life expectancies are very broadly the same, year or two either way. And other kinds of differences, like being short or tall, or being a man or a woman, have impacts on life expectancy that are just as big as the variation in that group. I think Paul touched on it, that poverty is, for example, a more important indicator of life expectancy than obesity, although they're clearly got quite strong relationship. Thirdly, the assumption seems to be that obesity is a preventable cause of illness, implying that there's some straightforward way to lose weight once you've gained it. Now, I used to be a painfully thin child who gradually accumulated weight over adulthood, and I've tried every method under the sun to lose a stone or two and then put it back on again just as quickly as I lost it. As I said, I'll be at the front of the queue if anybody comes up with a surefire solution. But the idea that government can kind of will people slim seems to me to be, well, mad, really. Which leads me to my fourth and I think most important point. Scare stories lead to bad policy. What we've seen as a result of that scare about obesity is parents being threatened with having their kids taken away if they're very fat, and often the parents don't have much control over the situation. Lunchboxes being inspected for contraband like crisps or chocolate, or even the idea that school meals should be compulsory regardless of parental wishes. health trusts refusing treatment to obese patients, takeaway food shops being refused the right to trade, demands for fat taxes or sugar taxes. Even the school curriculum is being colonised by this issue now. One friend of mine told me of her shock when her daughter had been given an exercise in her English class to write a poem about obesity. I mean, of all the things we want kids to learn in English class, it's not about obesity. Kids being weighed actually is not a bad idea in terms of generally monitoring the situation. But as Paul mentioned, the letter home and the way that's communicated is actually counterproductive. God knows what food and body shape obsessions we're creating in the next generation. And much of this is driven by the misleading claim that the NHS will be bankrupted by obesity-related diseases. Actually, if you really want to go down that route, you want to have that terrible calculus of saying who costs the state more in the long run, then actually smokers are doing us the biggest favour of all, because they'll die long before they'll need pensions or lots of social care. Obese people, if it is true about life expectancy being shorter, are into mean. And actually, it's the non-smoking, skinny people who are actually going to cost the state the most in the long run. It's just true. They're going to live longer and they're going to require more services. Andrew used the phrase regime. I'm sure he didn't mean it like this, but I kind of associate the word regime with Latin America in the 1970s. And I think what we need is actually a more humane approach to the problem. That for most people, carrying a bit of spare tire or being mildly obese makes little difference to their lives or to their life expectancy. But for the minority of the population that Paul was really focusing on, and I do agree here that it's a very substantial problem, excess weight becomes a barrier to being active in the world and has a very strong connection to chronic disease. So we need to focus our efforts on the medical care and treatment of those people rather than having this scattergun approach that we have at the moment, and a more open-minded research effort about finding the causes of obesity and diabetes, with suggestions that go beyond eating less and moving more. If we do have to have social interventions, let's have ones that provide opportunities, that have no regrets policies, so that even if they make no difference to anybody's weight, they provide more opportunities for a fuller life. So, for example, giving children more opportunities to play independently will allow them to develop relationships and mature as people, regardless of whether they lose weight or not. The same with children's independent mobility. I'm very glad our timekeeper here is Mayor Hillman, who has been looking at this issue for 40 years. And one of the things we disagree about a lot of things, but we agree very much about the importance of this thing. Again, regardless of whether kids lose a pound in weight or not, because it gives being able to travel independently certainly has the benefit of giving children self-reliance, resilience, the ability to act as independent people as early as they can in their lives. I think that kind of approach, one that's not focused on bans, on lectures, on whatever, but creating opportunities will be more successful at helping people live their lives. And in the meantime, let's focus on that relatively small percentage of people who have a really serious problem with obesity. They're the people that really need our help. Thanks.
Right, well, you've clearly thanked all four. I will do exactly the same, and although you can't thank me for chairing the debate that effectively, being that we're nearly up to half one and haven't actually got any debate going. I may as well ask one question, unless anyone's got one they want to start with, then yes, we'll go to you, sir, in the glasses at the front.
I think I detect some consensus here in that there's Tony Hockley from the London School of Economics. I know there's consensus in that Andrew spoke about obesity being tackled by activity as an activity in itself is a good thing. And food policy tends to have negative consequences as well as positive. So I have a very similar approach. I know as an economist, our decisions about our health are very much based on our risk attitudes. And one of the issues with unstructured physical activity is parents bubble wrapping children. And I recently saw some research from Australia in which parents were interviewed about this, and they acknowledged it was a bad thing. They regretted that children didn't have the unstructured opportunities to take risks and learn about risks that they had as children, but then gave a list of reasons why And there are even things that, if you reduce the speed outside schools, so you do the infrastructure things about creating nice space, you reduce car speeds, and parents would then say, well, it makes drivers overconfident, then it makes the kids too relaxed, and they're more likely to run on the road. And actually, how we turn around these social norms is a huge challenge, but I think a fundamental challenge. And as William Byrd said, it's an indictment of our society if we think that walking down the road is a dangerous activity. And we really need to tackle those things.
Is there a question? Sorry, is there a question?
Well, I think if anyone has any ideas on, it may be that William Byrd has examples where they've tackled the social norms as well as the infrastructural issues, so that these unstructured activity becomes lifestyle and persists.
I think it is normalising different behaviour, and I think in a way we're having to deal with this in an industrial way. I mean, Paul deals with the very severe ones, which are actually disasters, and I see them in the clinics as well. And then there's a sort of gradient of getting more people who are less overweight, but it's that big cohort in the middle we need to shift to become more active. And what we've done, in the work we've done with our Beat Street in Reading and Thurrock and other places in the country, is we've normalised the different behaviour. So we had a riot in the playground in Aldershot with the Director of Public Health watching it, and she was quite horrified and pleased at the same time, is that children were refusing to be dropped off at school by their parents because they were going to let the team down. And there was a normalising of actually it was better to be walking with your parents, even though they had to take a detour. And the parents said, we're so exhausted, we've been doing this for 4 weeks now, thank God this thing's finished, because we're absolutely been walking and walking and walking. But actually, it changed their behaviour, and that's continued for a long time. Yes, there's been a drop-off, but there have been some who've stayed, and the next time it happens, we have to change this normalisation, and it's not going to be health that's going to do it, and it's not going to be overweight, and it's not going to be activity. It's going to be that actually it's a good thing for children, it's a good thing for our school, it's a good thing for us as a society, and actually we want to take that responsibility. So we've done it in a very small way, but there are lots of other ways it could be done.
Yeah, the glasses at the back. Yeah. Oh, microphone there.
Thanks. I'd just like to make one comment about what Rob Lyons said. I think one class writing one essay about obesity cannot be categorised as colonising the school curriculum. What rubbish. We can all live off tuppenny halfpenny anecdotes like that. To Andrew Lansley, because I don't want to be, gratuitously upsetting to just one of the panel, getting a few figures on the front of food packets is no big deal, because the people who most need to read them may not be able to. And I think we need to be just a bit more draconian on the providers of junk food. Let's tax supermarkets at different rates according to how much junk they sell. Because while we're busy rearranging the deck chairs on the front of food packets, obesity is getting worse, and it's the quality of life as well as the longevity that counts. Have I missed anybody?
You want to come back on that, Andrew?
Well, only just to say, starting from about 15 years ago, we ended up 5 years ago with about 3 or 4 different systems for putting information about the components of food on the front of. I mean, I'm not making any great. All I was saying was that we got to a consistent system. Your chances of getting a population to take the trouble to look at what's on the front of their food and understand it is going to increase if there is a consistent presentation across all the supermarkets, and that's what we've got to.
Yep, so at the front. So the microphone's heading in your direction.
Mayor Hillman from Policy Studies Institute. What intrigues me about the contributions from the platform since we started is an insufficient, in my view, focus on the causes of obesity from the perspective of children's freedoms. I speak about it with some degree of authority that I think I can claim, because it's an area that inter alia I've been looking at for close on 50 years, in fact. In 1970, at our Policy Studies Institute, I instituted surveys of children's freedoms at schools all around the country, 1970. And what horrified me at that time was to find that 20% of 7 and 8-year-olds didn't go to school on their own. And I thought, it can't be 20% who are ill or sick or something like that. There must be other contributory causes. Subsequently, we had the opportunity 20 years later in 1990 of going back to the same schools and in effect monitor the changes that occurred within a generation of the freedoms that parents allow their children. How these were based on survey, in all instances, based on surveys of that children filled in, and then that they took home a questionnaire for their parents to fill in, namely focused on whether if their parents did restrict their children, on what grounds they did so. We went back again to the same schools in 2010, so we've got a 40-year coverage of this subject, and what we found an even continuing process down to such a low level. Just if it was by 1992, 91% of 7 and 8-year-olds were taken to school, in other words, not allowed to go out on their own. By 2010, it was down to 2%, and probably now it's close on 0%. Now, what is the implication of this is because parents' responses, not surprisingly, where we can't allow our children to go out on their own because the environment out there is so dangerous, principally from traffic, but also from this exaggerated fear of adaptation, abduction and molestation. But again, what it illustrates, and it was not in our surveys, we do cover all aspects of children's lives, is this dangerous focus on the journey to and from school, as if children's lives revolve just around going to and from school. Children only go to school on just over 1 in 2 days of the year. They also, in the warmer months, have leisure lives when they come home from school. And that is, in my understanding of the subject, the damaging effects on children's physical, mental and emotional development, because they are under adult supervision and surveillance the whole time. And one of the speakers did rightly make reference to the fact that children have got to develop their own experience in order to know how to cope with the world. And if you overprotect them, as we are increasingly doing, then they won't know how to cope with it when they get to their teenage years, when they can tell their parents to bugger off and not and to say, well, we're doing things on our own. But it is the whole lives, and I'm glad that the point was made also about children's well-being, which isn't a sort of, you don't see it as a proper feature of public policy, is children's freedoms, and what is the primary source of it? It's the growing danger of traffic.
I respect the length of time you've done it and the studies you've done. What is your solution to saying that children need the freedoms or should be allowed the freedoms? How would you go about allaying parents' fears of road traffic, of abduction, of societal change? What's your solution? Would you like to ask any of the panel that?
Several books of this subject.
Okay, well,
many reports, but obviously the primary source, I mean, this comes from the parents, the primary source of concern for the parents is the dangers of the outdoor environment. That's what needs to be addressed, and how we can go on believing that, for instance, in urban areas, a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit is almost unreasonable. 20-mile-an-hour speed limit is unreasonable when the consequences of having lower limits is that children are then far more likely to be allowed out on their own. And to deal with the issue of obesity from that source, in other words, children being free, not in discrete places like green spaces, because that overlooks the fact that the children have got to get to the green spaces, and parents don't see that it is safe for them to get to the green spaces, however attractive those green spaces are. And again, it reflects this attitude that children are second-class citizens for whom we need to take care and look after.
Yeah, well, those points are very good, but in terms of actually having a societal change, you need something other than those research.
Lower speed limits, for instance, and the promotion.
I guess it comes to the final question that I can ask the panel is that.
Sorry, just make the last point. Most children have got bicycles, very few indeed are allowed to use them. What a crass society we've allowed to develop.
I guess the final question now is past time is, if you take smoking, according to which figures you believe that the increase in smoking cessation has been making them smoke outside. is it time for prevention and intervention to stop the, if we say there is, as Paul said, there is an obesity crisis, I'll start with Andrew, work this way down, is it time prevention, about intervention to prevent, or is it going to be done through encouraging policy?
Well, I just say, I mean, I do think I think it's important for us to promote physical activity and to change the environment in which we live. And that's physical environment and the food environment in which we live. I think we can make that happen. I think that will make some impact overall on the extent to which it's possible for people to maintain a healthy weight. I think, in a sense, listening to my fellow panellists, I think the issue really comes down to, with Paul, how much of this activity on prevention should be diverted toward treatment, or that's probably characterising it wrongly, is at the same time, you know, are there, and he quite rightly says, are there a significant number of young people who are severely at risk for whom we are failing to provide? And actually, he's quite right, in the rest of the NHS, we don't treat prevention and treatment as actual alternatives. We understand that the more prevention, the better, but that doesn't obviate the moral obligation toward treatment, and we do have to acknowledge that, and I think Paul was right to point to it.
Just picking up from when I worked in Natural England, the whole idea was about how to get children in that roaming area. 90%'s been lost since the 1970s, which fits in exactly as you're saying. Actually, the environment is safer in many respects. Traffic is still bad, but the environment is safer, and certainly abductions have not gone up as people feel. So it's a fear, and it's a fear that actually runs through society. I think we're a more fearful society in every way, but one of the biggest fears is being a bad parent. And if you're at the school gate and you let your child walk to school and you're being victimized as a bad parent, you will not get any child walking to school. So you have to create the norm that if every single parent is doing it, and it's being a good parent by letting your children walk, then actually the safety of the actual traffic and the abductions disappear, because being a good parent is far stronger incentive. So we've got to try and change our attitude. We can change the environment. I know you've worked for many, many years in that environment. Of course we should. But we've got to get that perception of what is it being a good parent for your children. And if it's going to lead to obesity, and you see all the figures that Paul is giving, surely that's being a bad parent. So that's not an education, it's a social movement moving up, where that's what we're trying to do. The only other thing I would say on the kind of intervention is that actually children's blood pressure and their endothelial changes are taking place at the age of 6 or even 8, 8 or even 6. So we're seeing changes in their body right from those early ages when they're inactive and they're eating too much. I would like to think this treatment prevention, I'd like to change that to thinking those children should be treated by interventions because they are getting damaged already. We can't see it, we can't even measure it very often, and certainly, but actually if we start that area early, and as Paul said, we get that big trajectory of children who are already starting to laying down for cardiovascular disease and diabetes for the future. We can measure it, we can start that treatment early, and I think that would be a better concept for people to see.
And in terms of being a good parent, and the one thing that of parents that, I have 3 young children, that the one thing we are as parents, I think, afraid to say is no to our kids. Is that the one thing that being a good parent, you shouldn't be afraid to say no to? I want to do this, I don't want to do that. And
well, we're getting children now taking their parents for walks and taking their parents for bike rides. That's where the area we're wanting. But we switched it round for Pester Power, rather than Pester Power of sweets and cakes and not going for a walk. The Pester Power, because they want points for their school, has shifted the other way around, and that works extremely well. And actually then the parent thinks, for goodness sake, why haven't I done this before? We've gone on a bike ride, we've had a great time, and we did it because we've never had that chance to do it. So giving out people that first opportunity, it's the nudge theory, I'm afraid, in many respects, but it does seem to help.
So Paul, nudge theory or intervention for you?
So I think polarising treatment and prevention is not very helpful. I think what we really need to do is think about what it is we're trying to achieve, and no one can deny the absolute value of free-range kids. Absolutely fundamental, and it's a fundamental part of the intervention work we do with our obese children. But I think where we've made a mistake is we clump everything into prevention and treatment. I would frame it slightly differently. I would talk about primary prevention, which is good physical activity promotion, good school sport, good healthy eating, so on and so forth, for the 70% of kids that are well and will relatively well throughout most of their life. Then we have about a third of our kids who already have a problem that this prevention has not worked. And we need what I would term secondary prevention, which you might argue is intervention with that group before they end up in a hospital surgery, and which is treatment of ill health. The problem is we've actually got good prevention systems. We've got good school, we've got sports club. We've got lots of the systems available to us at a primary prevention level. We've got great hospitals and great support there in the treatment of ill health. But what we haven't got is secondary prevention. We have got nothing within our whole system that enables those that are not unwell enough to be in hospital and are not just, are not enabled by the current societal system. They need help, and we have nothing for them at the moment. And that would be how I would help people characterize what prevention means. It's primary and secondary, and it's focused, and it, in my mind, makes more sense, because what you can do is, once those people understand where they're at, you can enable them. And at the moment, most obese people that I work with feel completely disenabled throughout most of their life. And the letters, and for some families, are the nail in the coffin of, we've got a problem, we're told we're really bad at school every single day, we're at the gates and we can see we're the fat family, and then we get this letter that tells us, now confirms we're the really fat, bad family. So it's about focusing our attention on the different needs of different parts of our population, and we just don't have that at the moment.
And the measures that are in place for prevention, you feel they're being taken by the worried well, who are paying attention to the literature and the
because they're enabled to. Absolutely, they're enabled to. If we look at school sport, both of us and probably other panel, I benefited massively, not as massively as you did, obviously, but I benefited massively from great school sport. That's what I benefited from. But if I'd have been if I'd have a different set of characteristics, I might not have been able to benefit from that system. And I think that's the fundamental problem, that these kids slip through the net and they're on a trajectory which is not good for our society in the future. That's what all the evidence says.
Rob, last word.
Well, I mean, the impulse behind discussions like this seems to me an entirely altruistic one, or a good one, in the sense that you see kids who are struggling and you want to do something. But my inclination is, wherever possible, you keep the government out of it, because government has a bad habit.
We need to put more hands in this country.
Has a bad habit of making things worse and actually emphasising freedoms and choices. So, for example, even if you wanted to have your 8-year-old go to school independently on your own, you'd probably end up in front of a panel of social workers now demanding to know why you'd let the child do that. Even though when I was 8 years old, I did go to school on my own, just crossing main roads and that kind of thing. I did have the opportunity to that independent play out on the street or in a park or whatever. Not that I'm saying that that's going to solve obesity, but it's typical of, like, when in doubt, introducing another regulation or another form of control. And actually, it would be much better to give people much more freedom about these things. And, alongside that, having a focused effort on trying to understand why a small proportion of the population does get really fat, and helping those people, but where it becomes disabling, where it does have a big impact on life expectancy. And that's a scientific and health challenge that I don't think has really been embraced yet. If we could combine those two things together, I think we'll have a lot more success.
That's a very positive way. I'm glad to make a note of that, or else actually should be ending the debate. Well, thank you so much to all four of the panelists, and thank you so much for attending. So, show appreciation for the